Watch TLDR ad-free, get exclusive videos, and soon the daily briefing by signing up to Nebula for just $15 a year. And the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle deal is linked in the description. With Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the possibility of war spilling out across the European continent, much of the media's attention has been directed at NATO, the transatlantic mutual defense treaty between the US, Canada, and most of Europe. But while NATO is obviously the preeminent European security alliance, you might be surprised to hear it's not the only one. In fact, Europe is covered in a complicated array of overlapping multilateral security arrangements. So in this video, we're going to be looking at all of these various alliances, how they overlap, and whether they could come into play anytime soon. Before we start, we're rapidly closing in on 400,000 subscribers. So if you want more like this and want to lend us a hand, we'd really appreciate it. Anyway, while there's lots of niche security agreements we can and will get into, it makes sense to start with the big one, NATO. As you probably already know, NATO is a security alliance between the US, Canada, and most of Europe. NATO is the successor to the Western Union, a military alliance formed between Britain, France, and the Benelux countries in 1948. Originally, the US didn't want to get involved, but the Soviet blockade of Berlin in June 1948 convinced Truman that the US needed to maintain a presence in Europe to counteract the Soviet influence on the continent. And in 1949, NATO was formed between the Western Union countries, the US, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal. Much to Putin's annoyance, though, NATO has since expanded and now includes 30 member states. If you know anything about NATO, it's probably Article 5 of their founding chapter, which sets into stone the Mutual Defense Clause, which states that an attack on one country ought to be treated as an attack on all. In practice, this means that if a NATO member is invaded and triggers Article 5, then all of the other members should join in defending them, assuming they agree with Article 5's invocation. Despite a statement from NATO in 2008 that Ukraine would join the alliance in the future, Ukraine isn't currently a NATO member and is unlikely to become one anytime soon, which is why NATO have so far stayed out of the conflict. Nonetheless, there's definitely a non-zero chance of NATO getting involved at some point in the future, which is why the media is focused on them so much. This could either be via confrontation on Ukrainian territory, say if NATO tries to enforce a no-fly zone, or Russia attacks a military shipment from a NATO member, or on NATO soil, if Putin decides to continue his neo-Soviet conquest into Eastern Europe, as we actually discussed in another recent video, which is linked below. This might sound far-fetched. If Ukraine is proving difficult for the Russians, then NATO looks impossible. But a recent poll found that 75% of Russians want Russia to continue its military operation into Poland. And former Prime Minister and current Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, recently penned a somewhat sinister article titled "On Poland," where he claimed that Poland's talentless, senile politicians were indulging in US-led Russophobia and acting against Polish citizens' interests. Medvedev's article, which made reference to Poles and Russians' shared cultural heritage, is ominously similar to Putin's essay on the historic unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which he used to precede the invasion. Anyway, while NATO might get involved, that's all we need to discuss for now. And that's NATO explained, the big one. But as we mentioned earlier, NATO isn't the only security agreement in town. For starters, the EU is looking more and more like an independent security alliance, something we discussed in another video, which is also linked below. But beyond even the EU, there are a whole load of smaller and relatively unknown security arrangements, and we're going to go through them in the order of how many members each one has. Starting with the 13-member European Intervention Initiative, known as E12. E12 is led by France and was first articulated by Macron in September 2017. It's grown from its original 8 members in 2018 to 13 members today, with the notable inclusion of Sweden and Finland, neither of which are NATO members. Unlike NATO, the E12 has no formal mutual defence clause and no standing force. Instead, it's more of a forum for intelligence sharing and reinforcing bilateral agreements. Next on the list is the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, or JEF, a 10-member alliance created in 2014. Like E12, the JEF doesn't include a mutual defence clause, so member states aren't obligated to defend one another in the event of an invasion. Instead, it's more of a framework that enables immediate and multilateral reaction to threats perceived by member states. So, France and the UK have their own independent security groupings. But what about the big beast in Europe, Germany? Well, there isn't actually a German equivalent, but Germany did introduce the Framework Nations concept in 2013 before the 2014 NATO summit. The FNC is mostly about facilitating military spending so that European militaries complement each other. Essentially, the idea is that only the largest European states, Germany, France, and the UK, as well as maybe Italy and Turkey, can afford to have their own complete militaries. So other, smaller European states should instead pursue a depth instead of breadth strategy, specializing on certain areas. In this sense, the FNC is more just a way of thinking about European security than an actual alliance in itself. Along with France and the UK, Germany is also part of the Organisation for Joint Armament Cooperation, or OCA, which essentially manages collaborative military programs. OCA was founded in 1996 with 6 members, who are occasionally joined by other EU or NATO members for specific OCA programs. Next on the list is the Nordic Defence Cooperation, otherwise known as NORDEFCO, a 5-member arrangement between, you guessed it, the Nordic countries. As with JEF and E12, participation is voluntary, and it's actually more about strengthening defence capabilities via cooperation. You've then got the 4-member Visegrad Group, an alliance between the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, which was formed in 1991. And while the Visegrad Group is predominantly a political grouping, it does have a security element. Members engage in joint procurement and military exercises, usually via their EU battle group, which was first made active in 2016. There are, by our count, 3 trilateral European security agreements which actually involve Ukraine. They are the new British-Polish-Ukrainian Trilateral Pact, signed in February of this year, the Lubin Pact, which involves Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania, and the Association Trio between Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, all of whom simultaneously submitted EU accession applications in reaction to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, none of these are mutual defence clauses. Otherwise, well, the war in Ukraine would have spilled out into the rest of Europe. We also don't really have time to dive deeper into Ukraine in this video. So if you want to know more about these trilateral pacts, we have a whole video on them exclusively on Nebula. And you can learn more about that at the end of this video. The other notable trilateral European security agreement is the Baltic Naval Squadron, a naval cooperation agreement created in 1998 between the Baltic states. Notable bilateral European security arrangements include the Anglo-Portuguese Pact, which dates all the way back to 1373, the recent French-Greek Security Pact, and the British-French Alliance, which was codified in the 2010 Lancaster Treaties and manifest in the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, a British-French military force involving up to 5,000 personnel. The British and the French aren't the only ones with joint forces, though. There's also the Franco-German Brigade and the German-Dutch Corps. Anyway, you get the point. Beneath NATO and the EU are a whole load of overlapping European security agreements. How all of these interact in the case of a full-scale war on the European continent is an open question. But the chances are that most military cooperation will end up being done at the NATO level. This isn't to say that they're useless, though. Security alliances should, in theory, improve cooperation and complementariness between militaries. but some analysts have argued that it might be a good idea to formalize the relationships between these smaller security arrangements and NATO to avoid ambiguity in the event of a full-on war. As I said earlier, if you want to learn more about Ukraine's security alliances and the groupings keeping them safe, then check out our video on that topic, where we dive deeper specifically into Ukraine. That video is only available on Nebula though, the streaming service my creator friends and I teamed up to build, where you can watch all of TLDR's videos ad-free and get a bunch of exclusive content which will never make it to YouTube. Also, next week we're bringing back our show The Daily Briefing, and while the abridged version will be available on YouTube, the full briefing will only be on Nebula. And it's not just us either. All of our favourite creators are already there, like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, Polymatter, Legal, Half as Interesting, and many more. But wait, we said this video was brought to you by CuriosityStream, right? Well, as a platform full of some of the best documentaries online, they naturally love educational creators like us. And as such, we've worked out a deal whereby if you sign up for CuriosityStream using the link in the description, you'll also get free access to Nebula. That's not a free trial either. You'll get access for as long as you're a member. And to make things even better, for a limited time, they're offering a deal where you can get 26% off their already low price, making an entire year of both services less than $15. Less than $15 a year for your favourite educational creators, as well as superb documentaries on CuriosityStream. Signing up with the link below gets you the deal, directly supports TLDR, as well as getting you original content, the extended daily briefing, and an ad-free experience on Nebula.